Hey, I'm Stephanie Rublitz. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are carrying on. This is episode 2 of my coat making series, and I'm basically trying to show how to add, and I'm learning in this, how to add tailoring techniques to a pattern that doesn't necessarily call for tailoring in terms of like pad stitching and shaping and all that kind of stuff. And just sort of level up the garment a little bit. It's something that I've been really excited to teach myself, and I wanted to share that journey with you. So I'm really focusing this series on the actual shaping and tailoring part of the garment. So hopefully you'll be able to transfer that to whatever coat or jacket you're making. I am using a resource. I've been using Tailoring, a classic guide to sewing the perfect jacket. I just got this at my local library, Fish Creek Library. And this really just sticks to the technical aspects. It doesn't talk about fitting and all that kind of stuff. So your muslin and your fit, whatever you do for a practice garment, that's up to you. Then grab this. So today we're working on shaping the front of the bodice. Now most of us probably think that's just the lapel, but there's actually quite a bit of shaping. As I mentioned in my last video, there are things that can happen at the top of your front bodice where because of the shape of our bodies, where we might get like weird dips and wrinkles and stuff. So the direction that you put your horsehair canvas or your tailor's canvas is going to help give some stability and kind of just have like that nice slope over the chest. So there's not a lot of pad stitching on the chest, but there is 2 layers that overlap for the interfacing for this area right here. Plus, you want your interfacing to come completely around the arm side so that it gives stability to your sleeve, which is going to have obviously a ton of wear and tear and pulling on it. And when you interface this way, you're just going to get so much more longevity out of the garment. It's not going to sag and sort of pull out of line over time. And then, yes, we are absolutely going to use a ton of pad stitching techniques to have that lapel fold open. And not only do you want your lapel to fold open nicely and sit on the side of your chest, but you want that, that lapel point, kind of like the points on the collar that we did last week. You want them to kind of push into your chest so that you don't accidentally have them kind of peeling away from you. And just that little bit of pressure of having them roll into your chest. They won't ever roll completely on you, but they'll just push in enough that they lay nice and flush on your chest. Okay, now just in case you didn't see the collar video, I just want to review quickly. I'm using 2 kinds of interfacing on the front panels of my garment. I am using this tailor's canvas, and I'm also going to be using just the thicker sew-in interfacing. This I'm going to use coming down from the chest down to the bottom of the coat. It's a fairly long coat, and this is mostly just to give stability for the buttons. It gives a little bit extra weight to the fabric and makes those buttons not pull through your fabric, and gives stability to the buttonholes as well. It's not necessary to use this stuff all the way down the front. This is significantly cheaper, so if you're looking for a way that you can cut costs, that was kind of a happy accident that I realized, because I took what was left on the bolt of this stuff at the fabric store and I didn't have enough. But I think in future I would just stick with this down the front of the garment for the button placket area because, yeah, it's cheaper, so why not? All right, so the first thing I need to do is trace out my pattern pieces from my interfacing. Now, this is for the front of the arm side and across the chest, but I had to do quite an adjustment to my arm side, so I'm kind of going back and forth between the bodice pattern that I did the adjustments, and you can see I actually had to move the arm side quite a bit. So if you have to do any arm side adjustments to your pattern, make sure that you do those same adjustments on your interfacing pieces, because it's really important that you have your interfacing at that arm side to help support your sleeve. Okay, I just want a little side note about this arm side, because some of you might be like, whoa, that's a big change. I have, my shoulders are set back, far, compared to most people. And so I did film sort of what I had to do to change that arm side. And I think I still have all of the footage. I didn't edit it up into a video for my channel though, because I thought that's such a particular fit issue. I didn't know if it would really be relevant to many people. If you want to see how I did that, let me know in the comments. And if a few people are like, yeah, I want to see that, then, and I think a few people are going to benefit from it, then I'll edit it up and I'll put it on the channel. But for most people, just to like show, let me try and, so that's probably like, oh, and I'm in a black shirt, of course. That's probably a neutral shoulder. Lots of people have like shoulders that are curved forward, which is like, makes sense, right? We're all on computers, we're working at counters, like it's a thing that happens to bodies when you're hunched a lot. So if that's like forward shoulder and that's like neutral shoulder, that's my shoulder. So yeah, it's a really particular fit problem, and if you want to see it, I'll show it to you, but if nobody wants to see it, then I'm not gonna. All right, here's my lapel piece. You can see I have marked my seam allowance all the way around the outside. Now, I do need this to fold, and we're gonna do that with our stitching. So I'm going to run a line where my lapel is going to fold, and that's from my seam allowance line at the top to the seam allowance line right at the corner where you see the lapel sort of protruding from the main piece. All right, so that line that we drew for the roll line is also going to be our anchor line for our stitching. So I'm going to start marking my lines from my anchor line out to the point of my lapel, and I'm going to start marking them at 1/4 inch. And then as I get closer to the point of my lapel, I'm going to change that to 1/8 of an inch. And honestly, it's by guess and by golly. I'm just sort of looking at the pictures in the book and going from trying to do what I see. All right, so let's take a look at all the pieces for the front interfacing. I have my lapel, I have my shoulder support around my arm side, and I've marked a few lines where I'm gonna stitch those together. And then I also have this piece of sew-in interfacing that I'm going to use as the rest of the length down that front piece. So I have stitched my 3 pieces of interfacing together, and I actually have them now pinned to the front panel of my garment. Now I'm just going to take this bright pink thread and I'm going to throw in some big fat basting stitches just to hold everything together. My fabric is super shifty, so I definitely need to do this, and even if it wasn't, I honestly wouldn't skip this step. It might seem like kind of a waste because you pull it out later, or like an annoying chore, but honestly, don't skip this step. So everything is now basted together, and now I need to go and do a cross hatch stitch or cross stitch along the shoulder. Then I will do a running stitch along the underarm, and then I will go back to doing a cross stitch at the side. Typically, when you do this stitch, I should have already trimmed the seam allowance off of just the seams that I'm going to cross stitch next to, and the edge of my stitch should have actually gone over the edge of the interfacing. This sort of gives it the ability to shift around a little bit and move so that you're not going to have any weird pulling. I don't have to worry about weird pulling with this fabric. What I do have to worry about is its crazy ability to shift on me. So I really didn't want to have to take out my pins at this point because it's just one of those fabrics that you can be as careful as you want cutting it out, but as soon as you move the fabric, it changes shape. So I kept my pins in and I kept my full cross stitch on my interfacing, even though that's not like really how to do this stitch. And honestly, I wasn't disappointed that I did this. It all worked out fine, and I'm glad I went with just being sort of extra safe with this, just because of the fabric that I had. Now I am putting a running stitch just on the outside of the seam allowance line around the armhole. And through this all, like with the exception of the big basting stitches, I'm still being very careful to only take a few threads from my fashion fabric and not poke that needle all the way through. All right, once that running stitch is done, I'm back to doing the cross stitch down by the side seam. Once again, this would have been, if you were doing this with a non-shifty fabric, cut that seam allowance first and let your cross stitch go over the edge of your interfacing. All right, time to start the shaping. So I am doing a running stitch to make my anchor seam. And I did compare this to doing the backstitch on my collar, and honestly, I didn't really see that much of a difference. So I saw two different sources. One said to use a backstitch and one said to use a running stitch. So I tried one on the collar and one on the lapel, and honestly, I didn't see that much of a difference. I think what really matters is that your anchor seam is the first seam that you put in before you start your shaping. Now that I have my anchor seam in, I'm going to go ahead and put my twill tape. And the book says that you want it to be just a little bit tight, like so that it's pulling up. And you can see that I've got it pulling up a little bit here. And it's going to stretch so that I can stitch it on. But don't worry, it's not going to have like a gathered effect or anything like that. It's just to give the utmost stability because A, there's going to be a ton of weight hanging off of this. Not just the weight of the garment, but the weight of the lapel hanging off of that. And we are on a bias here, right? So we need that extra support so that over time, our garment doesn't get all sort of stretched out and pulled funny at the lapel line. So for the longevity of your garment, it really is worth it to go this step and put your twill tape at just behind your roll line. Now I'm stitching this twill tape down with a cross stitch, and I'm running my crosses across the width of the twill tape here. Okay, that's on. Now I can go ahead and shape my lapel. Whew, all that work, we haven't even gotten to shaping yet. Now, if you didn't see the video on shaping the collar, let me just revisit this for a second. I'm going to roll this over my finger to get the shape. And I'm going to bring my needle perpendicular so that it crosses the stitch line and it sort of wraps around the stitch line is the best way I can think of explaining it. So I'm bringing that needle right across the stitch line in a really shallow stitch, just picking up a few fibers of my fashion fabric. And I'm going at a width that matches the distance between my stitch lines. So if I'm working on stitch lines that are 1/4 inch apart, I want my stitches to be about 1/4 inch apart. And so even though they look diagonal, the stitches that I'm actually taking, like I said, are straight across that stitch line that I drew on there. All right, now I have run my stitches over all of my stitch lines, and you can see it just, without even being pressed yet, it just rolls beautifully and wants to push into itself. Yeah, I'm super happy with how this turned out. So there's a couple things I have to do before I'm done here. The first thing is I have to cut my seam allowance off of my lapel and all the way down the front of the garment. This is just to take off any extra bulk because we are actually going to be putting some more twill tape on the edges of the interfacing. I'm placing my twill tape right on top of the interfacing and matching up the edge of my twill tape with the raw trimmed edge of my interfacing. Now the really nice thing about twill tape is it does have enough give in it that will go around rounded edges quite nicely. And then when I come to the peak on the lapel, I'm just going to fold that. And so no, it's not going to come directly to the peak, but that's okay because it will actually keep us from winding up with too much bulk in the peak, and then it would be hard to turn it out. So I'm going to carry on and pin my twill tape all the way down the front of the garment. Then I just need to stitch this on with a running stitch on either side of the twill tape. Okay, so there we go. That is the shaping of the front of the bodice. Join me next week. We're going to talk a little bit about stabilizing the back. Again, there's not really any shaping that has to be done there, but when you think this whole garment is going to hang off of the shoulders, we really want to have as much sort of strength and reinforcement in the top of the bodice as possible if you want this garment to last a really long time. So, all right, so that's what we got going on for next week. That's all I got for you this week. So until next time, I hope you have a fantastic week, and I'll see you later.